Throughout history, one night has carried more expectations, more myths, and more cultural weight than perhaps any other: the wedding night. Across civilizations, religions, and centuries, this single night has been treated as a turning point, a moment of transformation, a threshold between identities, a test of morality, honor, and social order. For some, it was surrounded by celebration, for others by silence, for many by fear. But what actually happened behind closed doors across history? What did people truly expect from the wedding night, and how did those expectations compare to reality? Today, we are separating historical fact from romanticized fiction. We are examining how the wedding night has been understood, regulated, mythologized, and misunderstood from the earliest civilizations to the modern world. Welcome to the Intimacy Archives. This documentary explores the history of human relationships, sexuality, and cultural belief through rigorous historical research and established medical science. Nothing here is designed to shock. Nothing here is designed to sensationalize. Instead, we focus on evidence, on what historical records, medical texts, personal letters, and legal documents actually reveal. In this episode, we will travel through 7 major historical periods. We begin in the ancient world, Mesopotamia and Egypt, where written records reveal approaches to marriage and intimacy that may surprise you. We then move to classical Greece and Rome, where philosophy and social reality often collided. From there, we enter medieval Europe, an era burdened with myths that still shape modern assumptions. We examine the Renaissance, when art and anatomy reshaped understanding of the human body. We confront Victorian England, a period of deep contradiction and anxiety. We explore the early 20th century, when marriage manuals and scientific research exposed how unprepared many couples truly were. And finally, we examine what modern psychology and medicine tell us about tradition versus reality. Before we begin, a brief note. This documentary discusses intimate subjects using clinical language and historical context. All information presented is drawn from peer-reviewed research, historical documents, and established medical literature. With that understanding, let us begin. Our story begins in ancient Mesopotamia, around the year 2000 BCE. Often called the cradle of civilization, Mesopotamia gave humanity writing, formal law codes, and some of the earliest recorded ideas about marriage and family life. Contrary to modern assumptions, the ancient world did not approach intimacy with ignorance or shame. In many cases, their approach was practical, direct, and deeply integrated into daily life. One of the most important surviving sources is the Code of Hammurabi, compiled around 1750 BCE. This legal code contains extensive rules governing marriage, divorce, inheritance, and sexual responsibility. What is striking is what the code does not emphasize. There are no elaborate instructions about the wedding night itself, no moral sermons about sexual purity, no romantic framing. This absence is not repression. It reflects a practical worldview. In ancient Mesopotamia, marriage was primarily a legal and economic arrangement. Its purpose was stability, inheritance, legitimacy, and continuity of the household. The wedding night functioned as legal confirmation of the union, not as a dramatic emotional or sexual initiation. Medical texts, preserved on cuneiform tablets, discuss intimacy with remarkable frankness. They describe herbal mixtures, oils, and treatments intended to reduce discomfort and promote health in newly married couples. This tells us something important. Ancient Mesopotamian cultures understood that anxiety and physical discomfort could interfere with intimacy. They did not frame these difficulties as moral failure. They treated them as medical concerns. Another misconception is that the wedding night was always the first sexual experience. In ancient Mesopotamia, betrothal periods could last months or even years. During this time, couples sometimes lived together or engaged in intimate relations before the formal ceremony. The wedding night, therefore, often served as a public and legal marker rather than a private sexual beginning. It was about inheritance, property rights, and social legitimacy, not discovery. Mesopotamia surprises us. Ancient Egypt challenges expectations even further. From roughly 3000 BCE to 30 BCE, Egyptian society left behind one of the most extensive medical and literary records of the ancient world. Egyptian medical papyri, especially the Kahun gynecological papyrus and the Ebers papyrus, contain detailed discussions of reproduction, contraception, and sexual health. These texts were not hidden or taboo. They were standard medical references. They address menstruation, fertility, sexual function, and methods to prevent pregnancy. Marriage in ancient Egypt was primarily a social and economic contract. For many common people, marriage required no elaborate ceremony. A woman moved her belongings into a man's household, and the union was understood to exist. Egyptian love poetry reveals that affection, desire, and emotional intimacy were openly acknowledged, yet the wedding night itself was rarely framed as a moment of sexual initiation. Young Egyptians, particularly in urban areas, often interacted freely before marriage. Intimacy was not surrounded by the same fear that would later dominate other societies. Perhaps most striking of all, Egyptian medical texts recognize the importance of mutual satisfaction. Pleasure was discussed not as shameful indulgence, but as part of reproductive health. This perspective, that sexual well-being mattered, would later be suppressed or moralized away for centuries. Ancient Egypt reminds us that sexual ignorance is not natural, it is cultural. As we move forward in time, we enter Classical Greece, roughly 500 to 300 BCE. Here, for the first time, we see a clear divide between philosophical ideals and lived experience. Marriage practices varied dramatically between Greek city-states. In Athens, marriage existed primarily to produce legitimate heirs. Girls were often married around the age of 14 or 15 to men in their 30s. The wedding night followed a highly ritualized ceremony. After a public feast, the bride was escorted to her husband's home in a torchlit procession. This ritual symbolized the transfer of authority from father to husband. Greek medical writers recognized that the wedding night could be physically and emotionally distressing for young brides. Soranus of Ephesus explicitly warned that fear and tension could cause pain and difficulty during first intercourse. He advised gentleness and gradual intimacy. Whether this advice was followed depended entirely on individual households. Here, the gap between knowledge and practice becomes clear, and it is a gap that will repeat across history. To understand the Greek wedding night, we must first separate philosophy from lived experience. Ancient Greek thinkers wrote extensively about love, virtue, and the ideal household. Plato discussed the nature of desire. Aristotle analyzed marriage as a foundation of the state. Yet none of this philosophical discussion prepared most young brides for the reality of marriage. In Athens, women received little formal education. They were expected to manage households, produce legitimate heirs, and remain sexually modest. Discussion of intimacy was considered inappropriate for unmarried girls. As a result, many brides entered marriage with little understanding of what would happen on the wedding night. Greek medical writers recognized the consequences of this ignorance. Cyrenus of Ephesus, writing in the early Roman period, noted that fear and tension could cause physical pain, involuntary muscle contraction, and distress during first intercourse. He recommended patience, reassurance, and gradual intimacy. But medical advice did not always translate into practice. Power dynamics mattered. Large age gaps, rigid gender roles, and the social expectation of obedience often meant that the bride's experience was secondary to social duty. The wedding night was not primarily about emotional connection. It was about legitimacy. Sparta offers a revealing contrast. In Sparta, women married later, often between 18 and 20. Men were closer in age. Female physical strength and autonomy were culturally valued. Spartan marriage customs were unusual. Husbands often visited their wives secretly at night while continuing to live in military barracks. This system emphasized gradual familiarity rather than sudden transition. Even within a single civilization, there was no universal tradition. Culture, not biology, shaped experience. As Greek influence spread, Roman society absorbed and adapted it. Roman marriage combined ritual symbolism with legal pragmatism. Marriage was a contract. It established inheritance rights, social alliances, and family legitimacy. Roman weddings culminated in a ritual known as the deductio, the ceremonial escort of the bride to her husband's home. Friends and family accompanied the couple, singing songs that were often playful and explicit. The groom carried the bride over the threshold. This act was not romantic. It symbolized protection from bad omens and the transfer of authority. A crucial figure in Roman weddings was the pronuba, an older married woman who assisted the bride. Her presence acknowledged that inexperience could create difficulty. This detail matters. It shows that Roman society recognized the challenges of the wedding night. It was not treated as something that would simply resolve itself. Roman medical writers were unusually direct. Physicians such as Celsus and Galen discussed sexual relations with clinical precision. They wrote about anatomy, arousal, moderation, and health. The Romans also used contraceptives. Silphium, a now extinct plant, was so valuable that it appeared on Roman coins. Wedding songs, known as epithalamia, described the wedding night openly, leaving little to the imagination. Yet, despite this openness, Roman marriage remained unequal. It existed primarily to produce legitimate heirs and preserve family status. Romantic love, while celebrated in poetry, was secondary to duty. The Roman wedding night balanced ritual, medical awareness, and social pressure, a balance that would later be lost. As the Roman Empire declined, Europe entered the medieval period, roughly from the 5th to the 15th century. Few eras have been burdened with as many misconceptions. The most persistent is the myth of the so-called rite of the first night. According to this belief, a feudal lord possessed the legal right to sleep with a bride before her husband. Let us be absolutely clear. There is no credible historical evidence that this was ever a widespread legal practice. Extensive analysis of medieval law codes, church records, and court documents reveals no such right. Historians agree that the idea emerged later through satire, political propaganda, and literary exaggeration. So what actually governed medieval wedding nights? Christian theology dominated marriage ideology. The Church taught that marriage served three purposes. First, procreation. Second, the prevention of sexual sin. Third, mutual support. Sex within marriage was permitted. Pleasure, however, was morally suspect. Yet, once again, medicine told a more nuanced story. Medieval physicians inherited knowledge from Greek, Roman, and Islamic sources. One of the most influential texts was the Canon of Medicine by the Persian physician Ibn Sina, known in Europe as Avicenna. Translated into Latin in the 12th century, it became the standard medical reference. These texts acknowledged that fear, anxiety, and physical tension could prevent consummation. They recommended herbal preparations, patience, and gentle behavior. Some even acknowledged that female pleasure played a role in conception. One of the most fascinating sources from this period is the Trotula, a collection of medical writings compiled in Salerno, Italy. These texts discussed women's reproductive health in remarkable detail. They addressed pain during intercourse, anxiety, and remedies for discomfort. They demonstrate that medieval medicine understood the challenges of the wedding night, even when theology struggled to reconcile them. Customs varied sharply by social class. Among the nobility, the wedding night was often public. The bedding ceremony involved escorting the couple to the marriage bed. Attendants undressed the groom and bride. Clergy blessed the bed. Witnesses sometimes waited nearby. In some cases, proof of consummation was expected by morning. For peasants, customs were far simpler. Village celebrations ended with music, jokes, and communal escorting. The couple was then left with relative privacy. Court records revealed that non-consummation could be grounds for annulment. This placed enormous pressure on the wedding night. Anxiety was not personal failure. It was a structural consequence of expectation. As Europe emerged from the medieval period, the Renaissance brought profound changes in how people understood the human body. From roughly the 14th to the 16th century, art, science, and philosophy began to challenge inherited assumptions. Anatomical knowledge expanded rapidly. For the first time since antiquity, scholars systematically dissected human bodies in the pursuit of accuracy. Andreas Vesalius's De Humani Corporis Fabrica, published in 1543, corrected centuries of anatomical error. Leonardo da Vinci's private notebooks contained remarkably accurate studies of reproductive anatomy. For the educated elite, the human body was no longer mysterious. But here is the critical point. This knowledge did not reach most people. The vast majority of men and women remained dependent on tradition, folklore, and religious instruction. The wedding night, therefore, remained surrounded by ritual rather than education. This era also produced the first widely circulated marriage manuals. Some were surprisingly progressive. Writers such as Baldassare Castiglione argued that marriage should involve mutual respect and affection. Others reinforced older hierarchies, emphasizing male authority and female obedience. Contradiction defined the Renaissance. In Italy, weddings were elaborate affairs that could last for days. The bride's trousseau was displayed publicly as a symbol of family wealth and alliance. The marriage bed was blessed by clergy. Family members escorted the couple to the bedchamber. In elite households, the morning after the wedding night was sometimes semi-public. Visitors arrived with gifts and congratulations, sometimes while the couple remained in bed. To modern eyes, this lack of privacy feels invasive. To Renaissance society, it served a purpose. It publicly confirmed legitimacy, fertility, and alliance. The wedding night was less about personal intimacy and more about social order.
Yet medical understanding quietly advanced. Physicians increasingly recognized that fear and ignorance could cause difficulty. They advised patience and reassurance. But these insights remained largely inaccessible to those who needed them most.
Elizabethan England, spanning the late 16th and early 17th centuries, provides unusually rich evidence of changing attitudes, not only through medical texts, but through literature, court records, and personal letters. William Shakespeare's plays are filled with references to marriage, consummation, and sexual expectation. In Romeo and Juliet, the wedding night is urgent and tragic. In Much Ado About Nothing, virginity is treated as social currency. In A Midsummer Night's Dream, marriage and desire are playful, confusing, and chaotic. Wedding poetry, known as epithalamia, became popular. Edmund Spenser's Epithalamion, written for his own wedding, describes the anticipation leading to the wedding night with classical imagery and unmistakable implication. But literature tells only part of the story. Church court records reveal everyday reality. By this period, women in England married later than in medieval times. Early 20s became common. Courtship was more visible and prolonged. Couples often knew one another before marriage. Evidence of prenuptial pregnancy suggests that intimacy sometimes preceded the wedding ceremony. In some regions, a practice known as bundling existed. Couples shared a bed while clothed, sometimes separated by a board. This was considered supervised courtship rather than scandal. Yet, pressure remained. Non-consummation was still grounds for annulment. The wedding night carried legal weight. Performance mattered. Anxiety was unavoidable. The wedding night existed at the intersection of expectation, morality, and law. Now we arrive at the Victorian Era. From 1837 to 1901, British society underwent dramatic transformation. Industrialization reshaped daily life. Urbanization disrupted traditional communities. Scientific discovery advanced rapidly. Yet attitudes toward sexuality became more conflicted than ever. The popular image of Victorian repression is only partially true. Pornography circulated widely. Prostitution flourished in every major city. Medical journals discussed sexual topics with increasing sophistication. And yet, respectable middle and upper-class women were often kept profoundly ignorant. Many Victorian brides entered marriage with little or no understanding of sexual relations. Some believed that babies resulted from prolonged kissing. Others knew only that marriage involved a vague and frightening duty. This ignorance was not accidental, it was actively encouraged. Prominent physicians reinforced it. William Acton famously claimed that most women were not troubled by sexual feeling. Female desire was denied, dismissed, or pathologized. These beliefs shaped parenting, education, and medical advice. As problems became impossible to ignore, marriage manuals began to appear. Titles such as What a Young Wife Ought to Know and The Wedding Night promised guidance. Their quality varied dramatically. Some acknowledged that ignorance caused trauma. Others relied on euphemism rather than clarity. Grooms were often poorly prepared as well. Young men from wealthy families frequently had sexual experience with prostitutes. This created disease risk and unrealistic expectations. Working-class men might have had consensual experience, but little medical understanding. Across social classes, knowledge of female anatomy was minimal. Medical advice often worsened the situation. Some doctors warned that frequent marital relations could cause illness, madness, or exhaustion. John Harvey Kellogg argued that sex should occur no more than once per month.
The consequences were predictable. Diaries and letters reveal fear, pain, and confusion. Medical journals document unconsummated marriages lasting months or even years. Women experienced vaginismus, driven by fear and tension. Men experienced impotence, driven by anxiety. Couples were often too embarrassed to seek help. Yet Victorian records also reveal something important. Over time, many couples improved. Communication helped, experience helped, affection helped. The honeymoon emerged as a cultural solution. Travel provided privacy, distance from family scrutiny, time to adjust without pressure. Niagara Falls became an iconic honeymoon destination. Hotels discreetly catered to newlyweds' anxieties. Victorian medicine continued to advance. Physicians increasingly recognized that pain was not inevitable. They understood that anxiety played a central role, but social norms prevented.
The early 20th century marked a turning point. Change did not arrive suddenly or smoothly. It arrived unevenly, contested at every step. Several forces converged at once. Women's suffrage movements challenged traditional gender roles. Industrialization and urban life weakened old systems of supervision. World War I disrupted families, marriages, and expectations. For the first time, sexuality began to be studied not as morality, but as a subject of science. One book symbolized this shift. In 1926, Married Love was published. Its author, Marie Stopes, wrote from painful personal experience. Her first marriage remained unconsummated for years, not because of unwillingness, but because neither she nor her husband understood sexual relations. When she finally learned the truth from medical texts, she had the marriage annulled. She then wrote Married Love to prevent others from enduring the same suffering. The book was revolutionary. It stated plainly that women experienced sexual desire, that mutual pleasure mattered, that ignorance caused harm. The public response was explosive. The book sold tens of thousands of copies within months. It was banned in several countries. It was condemned from pulpits and quietly passed between couples desperate for guidance. Around the same time, another influential work appeared. Ideal Marriage by Theodore van de Velde offered explicit clinical instruction. It discussed anatomy, arousal, pacing, and emotional connection. It acknowledged female orgasm as a normal and significant part of marital intimacy. For the first time in Western history, the wedding night was openly framed as a shared experience, not a duty to endure. Despite progress, resistance remained strong. Throughout the 1930s and 40s, conservative forces fought to maintain silence. Books were censored. Sex education was restricted. Ignorance was still defended as virtue. But science continued. In the 1940s, a biologist named Alfred Kinsey began collecting data. Instead of relying on moral theory, he asked people about their real experiences. The results shocked the public. Published in 1948 and 1953, the Kinsey reports revealed a reality far removed from social ideals. They showed that many wedding nights were not joyful. A significant number of women reported their first marital sexual experience as neutral or negative. Many described pain. Many described fear. Many described confusion. Yet the data also revealed something critical. Most couples improved with time. Education mattered. Communication mattered. Ignorance, not biology, was the primary cause of suffering. For the first time, assumptions were replaced with evidence. After World War II, society sent mixed messages.
The 1950s encouraged early marriage and traditional gender roles. At the same time, marriage manuals became widely available. Honeymoons became standard. Premarital intimacy became more common than publicly admitted. By 1960, the birth control pill was approved. This single development transformed sexual autonomy. Sex was no longer inseparably linked to reproduction. By the 1960s and 70s, the sexual revolution had begun. The idea of the wedding night as a biological beginning started to fade. For many couples, it became symbolic rather than transformative. Marriage was no longer the universal starting point for intimacy. This shift exposed something important. The trauma historically associated with wedding nights was not inevitable, it was cultural. Today, we understand more about human sexuality than at any point in history. Modern medicine is clear. Pain during first intercourse is not inevitable. With adequate arousal, relaxation, communication, and lubrication, pain is unlikely. The hymen is not a seal. It is a flexible membrane that varies widely. Bleeding is not reliable evidence of virginity. Psychological research consistently shows that anxiety is the strongest predictor of negative first experiences. Education dramatically improves outcomes. Modern studies identify clear patterns. Positive experiences are associated with prior discussion of expectations, understanding anatomy, planned contraception, emotional safety, and trust. Negative experiences are associated with ignorance, shame, time pressure, unrealistic expectations. Across cultures today, wedding night expectations vary widely. In societies with comprehensive sex education, the wedding night is often symbolic. In more traditional communities, many couples still wait until marriage, but increasingly receive counseling and preparation. Globally, the pattern is unmistakable. Education reduces harm. Modern experts emphasize preparation rather than performance. First, education, understanding anatomy, arousal, and consent. Second, medical preparation, discussing contraception and health concerns in advance. Third, emotional preparation, openly discussing fears, expectations, and boundaries. On the wedding night itself, experts recommend avoid excessive alcohol, allow time to relax, communicate constantly. There is no requirement to follow a timeline. Intimacy develops over time. The idea of a single night defining a marriage is neither medical nor historical. So what have we learned from 5,000 years of wedding nights? There is no single tradition, only cultural constructions. Across centuries and civilizations, the same pattern repeats. Ignorance causes suffering. Education reduces it. The idea of the wedding night as inevitable trauma is not biology, it is history. The wedding night has always reflected a culture's deepest beliefs about power, gender, morality, and control. When knowledge is suppressed, fear fills the gap. When knowledge is shared, harm diminishes. Today, we have the information previous generations lacked. The question is no longer whether we know better. The question is whether we choose to act on that knowledge. Thank you for joining the Intimacy Archives. If this documentary helped clarify myths, challenge assumptions, or provide perspective, consider sharing it with others. Sources and educational resources are available in the description. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and remember, knowledge is power.